News Central now begins with updates on the G20 summit. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has announced that the African Union has been granted permanent membership in the group of 20 largest economies worldwide. He will speak in during the inaugural session of the two-day G20 summit. The announcement marks the AU's accession as a new member of this prominent global organization consisting of 55 nations. Shortly after the announcement, the Union of Comoros's president and the African Union chairperson, Azali Assoumani, took the seat as a full member of the G20. The African Union is a significant organization consisting of 55 member states collectively representing the nations across the African continent.
आगे की कार्रवाई शुरू करने से पहले मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं.
Now, for better understanding of this new development, I'm joined by Dr. Muda Yusuf, CEO Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. He joins us from Lagos, Nigeria. One welcome to you, Dr. Yusuf, and thanks for joining us on the news.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Dr. Yusuf, can you provide us with some background on the African Union's journey towards gaining membership in the G20? And what's the significance of this achievement for our continent?
Well, the G20 is a very powerful economic and maybe even political bloc. The G20 accounts for about 85% of the global GDP, and it also accounts for about 75% of global trade. So in order for Africa to be part of the mainstream of the global economy and global trade, I think the membership of the G20, of the AU, I think will bring a lot of value from those two critical perspectives. Currently, Africa accounts for just about 3% of global trade. And you need trade in order to also take advantage of the opportunities in the global economy. You need trade to take advantage of the global value chain across the world. So from the point of view of trade, I think it is something that is very significant. It also offers opportunities in the area of security. Because now in the G20, you have perhaps the biggest country, the most advanced economies are there, and most of the developing countries are also there. So there's much wider opportunity now to take advantage of being a member, to protect the interests of Africa and to ensure that you have protection in the area of insecurity, in the area of energy security, in the area of food security. So there's a whole lot that African countries can benefit from being members of the G20, given their size and given the strength of all the members of that bloc.
Now, Dr. Yusuf, what specific roles and responsibilities does the African Union anticipate taking on as a member of the G20, and how does it plan to represent the interest of its 55 member nations within the group?
Well, the AU, just as the EU, the European countries are also represented in the G20 by the EU. So it is something similar to that is now being replicated for Africa. And the whole idea of that is that rather than have all the 55 African countries in the G20, you have a representation in the person of the chairman of the AU to put on the table the critical interests of the African countries. So they can aggregate the critical interests of African countries. It could be something collective. It could also be the interests of the individual countries, depending on what issues are developing, and table it before the G20 countries. And the G20 countries are much more egalitarian. They are not as as hierarchical as what you have in the UN. There are better opportunities for multilateral cooperation, greater opportunities for bilateral cooperations within the framework of the G20. So the AU will be representing the interests of African countries, either individually or collectively, depending on the needs of each country in Africa.
Now, Dr. Yusuf, earlier you said that Africa accounts for a minuscule 3% of global trade. Now, how do you see the African Union's participation in the G20 impacting regional and global economic policies, especially in relation to issues such as trade, development, and climate change? What will it take to increase this 3% to a more robust percentage? And what's Africa really bringing to the table?
Well, trade benefits both sides, both the exporter and the importer. And trade is not just with respect to physical goods, it's also with respect to services. And Africa has a whole lot to offer in the area of services exports. We also have some measure of things that you can export in the area of commodities, but we are very weak in the area of manufactured exports. But the issue is that once you have this kind of cooperation with all these very big countries and the medium economies, the barriers to trade can be negotiated in a way that it will be easier for African countries to export to these countries. And it will also be easier for African countries to also import some critical things that they need, especially like capital products or equipment and things like that, from members of the G20. Because there is now a forum and opportunity for negotiation, because there is already now a platform on which to negotiate. So that is what it brings to the table. And it's not just